Okay, it's time for story number 2. Let's talk about the yellow wallpaper. We can begin with a discussion of the plot. Once again, there doesn't seem to be a great deal of plot when we think about the whole arc. This is a story where really not a lot happens. I mean, she spends her time in a room, and the more I think about it, the more I'm thinking maybe you guys are starting to hate me because we have a bunch of stories where not a lot of things are happening. But I tend to like stories like that because when we're talking about literature, we're not talking about all of the hype or the actual drama of the story. A lot of times, we're talking about how the story is functioning as a piece of art, how its form is working, and all sorts of things like that. So, I find stories where there aren't a lot of actual events going on to be kind of interesting to look at because there are other things to focus on besides the climax of the story. So yeah, I mean, when we talk about plot in this story, what happens? They arrive at this old ancestral home, right? It's a little bit creepy. They move up to the top floor in the room. They have the yellow wallpaper. It creeps her out. This is where she does her writing. This is where she's supposed to sleep. This is her rest therapy, right? And in the real world, she takes some walks, but nothing else really happens. What's happening is inside her mind and inside that room, but nothing in the actual world is happening. So there's not a great deal to talk about it in terms of plot when we talk about things happening in the real world. There's a lot going on up here, right? I mean, it's kind of a psychological story, and it's one of the reasons why I really like it. And that's a good segue when we're talking about point of view. So what is the point of view here? We have a first-person narrator, right? So we have the narrator talking about or narrating her life in this house. And let's think about how different this story works compared to Hills Like White Elephants. Because what do we have in that story? We had a third person, very limited narrator, right? Basically, all we have are our senses, just perception, mostly sound and sight. We have a little bit of description of the setting, but very brief, and the rest is dialogue. Remember, we can think of it as almost eavesdropping. This story is much different. Here we have a first person narrator, so we can have the actual physical descriptions where the wallpaper is described, right? So that's an outside external thing. But we also are privileged to the inner thoughts of the narrator, which is something that we don't have except for maybe a few words here and there in Hills Like White Elephants. So it's interesting to contrast the points of view and what happens or doesn't happen in the story. This has a much different feel from Hills Like White Elephants, although I think there are a lot of similar things going on, but they function very differently, right? And I think a lot of that has to do with the first-person point of view, because what's the real plot of the story is not what's happening in the real world, but what's happening in here. And we don't find out what's happening in here if we don't have a first-person narrator or a third-person omniscient narrator, and we don't have that in Hills Like White Elephants.